They showed the BBC is actually much closer to The Guardian and The Independent, on that metric at least, than it is to right-wing outlets.
The Americans are going down a terrible route of picking the winner themselves. So there is an utterly bizarre deal being done by Trump with Westinghouse and the AP1000 technology, where the Japanese have agreed to borrow buy a large amount of American bonds.
We've grown up with seeing the three-eyed fish in The Simpsons, and we think this is what nuclear energy means.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. Today I'm joined by Kristian, the IEA's Editorial Director, and Andy Meyer, the IEA's Energy Analyst. Today we'll be discussing a very turbulent week for the BBC. Government U-turns on child benefits and U-turns on income tax. And finally, whether Britain is about to experience a nuclear renaissance. But before we get into all of that, do remember that if you'd like to read our written content, do subscribe to our Substack, which is insider.iea.org. We'll have a link to that in the description. Okay, so on to our first topic. This week, the BBC has been in a bit of bother, basically because its Director General, Tim Davie, has resigned. Its CEO of News, Deborah Turness, has also resigned, and it's being sued for $1 billion by the President of the United States. Kristian, how did we get here?
Well, it's not a great week for the BBC, is it? But this isn't entirely new, so that there have been allegations of and inquiries into BBC bias several times before. This is a familiar topic. And I say it's not entirely, so whether there is bias in any one direction or another isn't entirely subjective. It's not just in the eye of the beholder. So I realize, obviously, where you see bias and the kind of bias you see depends on where you stand yourself. You could probably show me the ingredient list on a pack of cornflakes, and I would say, well, this is obviously Marxism. This is probably written by Mao Zedong. But in this case, so there have been, I saw a paper on this from 2 or 3 years ago by, I think it was Eric Kaufmann, who, where he just did one of those media analyses. So the way in which they've also documented the rise of the Great Awakening, that way you can just show the relative frequency with which particular terms that are associated with a progressive worldview, the frequency with which they are mentioned in the media, and they break this down by different media outlets, and just show an explosion after 2012, 13, 14, depending on the exact term. They've done something like that to just cluster UK media outlets by political orientation. So they look at the relative frequency with which words like white privilege, that gives away a left-wing worldview generally, unless you use it critically, ironically. How often do they appear in different media outlets? And the thing there is, on each individual term, you can argue, is this really the best way of looking at it? But what it does is, if you put them together, you see really they can, by using these terms to and the frequency with which they are used, if you group media outlets on that basis, you see that you have The Guardian and The Independent clearly on one side, you have The Telegraph, The Sun, The Daily Mail clearly on the other side, and they showed the BBC is actually much closer to The Guardian and The Independent, on that metric at least, than it is to right-wing outlets. It's not, as you would maybe have expected, somewhere in the middle. It's quite clearly more on The Guardian side. So this isn't just this one particular allegation. This is a long-standing topic. And every time something like that comes up, this raises the question, should we continue the BBC funding model that we have now with a license fee where financing it is mandatory? Once you have a device that can receive TV signals. And we used to write quite a lot about this in the past from a purely economic perspective. Is this model justifiable from an economic perspective? I'm opposed to the license fee, but in my case, this is more for boring Econ 101 reasons. So I don't necessarily expect positive outcomes from a change in the funding model, you sometimes get people on the political right who will say, well, once the BBC, if they relied on voluntary funding, if they were like Netflix, a subscription service, they would have to be more balanced because they would have to pay more attention to where their viewers are. I don't think that necessarily follows. It could well be that under a voluntary model, they would go more openly for being the guardian of the airwaves, and that would probably be a more viable model for them than trying to be this somewhere middle of the road, impartial or supposedly impartial presenter. And it could be that they go for that. So I wouldn't expect positive outcomes in the sense of outcomes that we would like from it, but it would still be just from an economic perspective. If something is not a public good, then it should not be organized and it should not be financed like a public good. I'd support it for that reason.
Okay. And specifically on the issue that led Tim Davis to resign, this was apparently, and yeah, it seems to be the case, a misleading edit of a Trump speech on January the 6th that made it look like he was explicitly instructing supporters to attack the US Capitol building, when these were actually two quite separate bits of the speech. Do you think this is a case of editorial decisions being driven by kind of internal, vaguely left-wing culture, or is it more just trying to be sensationalist in a way that's one of the kind of weird defenses that people have made of the BBC, that they're adjusting this, trying to heighten the excitement?
Yeah, but they're not usually sensationalist, are they? And when it comes to that, so there have always been two competing explanations for BBC bias when they were during previous waves. One is that the BBC has somehow been taken over by a cabal of cultural Marxists. That's popular on the political right in parts of the tabloid press. The other explanation, which I've always found more plausible, is that it's simply a sociological phenomenon, that the BBC isn't trying to be biased. It's not trying to be the Guardian. It's just that the people they employ are mostly educated, politically engaged middle-class people, and educated, politically engaged middle-class people are just left-wing. They just are.
So it's a general analysis. If we look at the specifics of the scandal that the BBC has got itself embroiled in, what happened was that in 2024, they broadcast an episode of Panorama that took two elements of speech that Donald Trump gave, spliced them together to make it look like he was inciting violence in the Capitol, which, if it were true, would not simply be a very serious criminal offence. And the Americans did look at this and decided that is not what happened. It was also the narrative of his opponent in an election. So the very serious allegation that has been made against the BBC is they are interfering in foreign elections by asserting political bias through inappropriate editorial practices. Now, this is not just us saying this, or the Telegraph or the Daily Mail. This has come from a memo that was given to their own editorial board and then buried and ignored, the Prescott memo. I didn't read the full memo until earlier today. And the reason I didn't do that is I wanted to understand how the spin war was communicating this to the public. And it's very clear that the detail in the Prescott memo has not been accurately communicated. It is so much more damning than just the narrative of Donald Trump sues the BBC. It's 35 pages resplendent with error after error after error across multiple issues, where the BBC simply haven't made just mistakes, but have deliberately concealed those mistakes and done so in a way that would actually encourage them to break their own charter potentially. And to be clear what I mean by that, the charter takes the Reithian principles from the founding of the BBC to inform, to entertain and to educate, and translates them into a set of principles. And where news is concerned, it's the number one. It has to be impartial and accurate. It is clearly not impartial to engage in the electoral narrative of the opponent of a leader of a foreign country. It is not accurate to use editorial finesse to make it sound like someone is saying something they have not said. So it's extremely serious, and it is not surprising that the Director General and the other employee have resigned. What is surprising is that the reaction from the BBC to their critics was not fulsome apology, but making excuses and then briefing the press to make it sound like there was a culture war going on, and this is all down to one individual on the BBC board. It's disgraceful.
Though, I mean, to be the sort of BBC defender in the room for a second, I mean, they have now issued a public apology to Donald Trump personally. I think that was yesterday, and I think even people who are very pro BBC do tend to acknowledge on this issue, on the Trump take, they did make a very, very serious mistake, or the external production company which they hired and didn't properly sort of vet made a very serious mistake. I think what some people are arguing, and I don't think it's on the face of it a totally unreasonable argument, is that the Trump administration reaction to this is over the top and is intended to try and chill press scrutiny, criticism of him in the US. And we've also, it's not just the BBC who Donald Trump has threatened to sue. There's also been various issues with ABC, which were very quickly settled after Trump became president. So is there any sort of issue that liberals can be kind of, I mean, in the sense of classical liberals, can be concerned about when it comes to political leaders going out of their way to sue news broadcasters?
Well, the chilling effect point is well made, and that speaks to the wider issues around Donald Trump and his volatile personality. But in this particular instance, he's got a point. I mean, as I noted, this is not just a bit of a mistake. This is very deliberate manipulation of output by a major and serious news organization whose reputation rests on their impartiality in an election period. So on this occasion, while I suspect he's not going to get very far with his $1 billion claim.
Yeah.
I think his reaction was not over the top.
Yeah, and this is the part that some of the BBC defenders don't get. So I've seen that Ed Davey from the Liberal Democrats now tries to frame this as an attack by a foreign leader on a British institution and tries to appeal to a sense of in-group patriotism where he tells people, you have to defend the BBC because this is your team and this is like a football match. You have to defend your side. And it really shouldn't work this way. In this individual case, okay, yes, he is obviously a foreign leader, a foreign politician. That doesn't mean that his criticism in this particular instance is wrong. And, well, he didn't choose to be involved in this if they are splicing his speech in such a way that it makes him say something that he didn't say. It's not unreasonable. And he probably would do that if it had been a different outlet as well. So this isn't about any peculiarities of the BBC.
Well, where I'd have some sympathy for Ed Davey, even though he's clearly engaging in classic political whataboutery by looking at the good things the BBC does to deflect from this particular issue. I don't actually think this issue says very much about what should happen on the charter renewal at the end of 2027. Whoever is the government in power at that time will have to make that decision. And all of the arguments for and against the current funding model, for and against the subscription model, for and against anything more innovative, do not rest on whether or not they got this particular episode of Panorama wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, agree. Let's move on to the fiscal situation. We've had an unexpected announcement pre-announcement, leak, whatever. Most of the budget seems to be sort of semi-pre-leaked. And this is about, it's unexpected because, we still have a massive budget deficit and government is neither willing to make any cuts nor seem to be too keen to raise taxes. And they don't want to cancel or in some way roll back on the two-child benefit cap. The principle being that it used to be child tax credit. It's now a component of universal credit. Which is paid on a per-child basis, and for most of the time, it would just be however many children you have. There would be a special element for each of them. In, I think, 2017, it was under the Conservative government, this was limited to 2 children. If you had more than that would be your choice financially. And well, according to the leaks, this is going to be scrapped in order to, well, raise children out of relative child poverty, possibly even absolute. Daniel, you've done some media appearances on that. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, yeah. So there've been two, as you point out, two big announcements or briefings this week from the government. The first was Rachel Reeves making very clear that the government intends to scrap the two-child benefit cap in its entirety. Now, Labour MPs have been calling for this and basically expecting it for, well, since the 2024 election. The government seems to have basically been dragged to this in the end by their backbenchers. And I think, okay, so you've got one fiscal aspect of this, which is removing the cap in its entirety is expected to cost £3.5 billion. There were some other intermediate options that were floated that would not cost quite so much. So one option which I think would have been better for the government to go down if they were really set on and repealing the two-child limit was to make it conditional on having someone in the household in work. Because from the research that's been done so far on the actual effects of the two-child limit on households on the receiving end of it, it doesn't seem to have had any impact on childhood educational outcomes, which lots of people are expecting. They're saying if you cut back these benefits, children in low-income, large families are going to start doing worse in school. No evidence for that whatsoever. But one thing we have seen is that the two-child limit does seem to have increased work incentives. So it does seem to have led to more, particularly mothers, going into work. And this is actually very similar to the data we see coming out of the US based on randomized control trials, where they sort of give low-income households sort of unconditional flat amounts of money. In fact, in a lot of cases, the only impact it seemed to have is to basically reduce the amount of work people do. So one way you could reduce this impact is say, okay, we are scrapping the two-child limit, but only for households who have someone in work, which is about 6 in 10 households affected by this. So if you were to make that change, the government would only be spending an extra 2.5 billion rather than 3.5 billion. But it would actually increase work incentives, because it would mean if you take on a certain amount of work, and you have, say, 3 children, you're now getting an additional roughly £3,500 in universal credit. So that could actually strengthen work incentives and save money. The government decided not to do this. I think it was always very likely that Rachel Reeves was going to back down on it. In some ways, it's actually really quite frustrating that they didn't do what many people were suggesting they should do around the time of the last budget, which was to link other cuts in things like winter fuel allowance and the £5 billion of, I say cuts, increase reductions in working age disability benefits that they on both of these they had to abandon their position in the face of backbench rebellion. It would have been very sensible to explicitly say in one go, okay, we are going to scrap the two-child limit, but in return, and we're going to pay for this by getting rid of winter fuel allowance and slowing down the increase in working age people going on to disability benefit, which is Pretty much. We often criticize the government, and I think very rightly, for always backing down on the spending cuts they announced. The one big area where they haven't done this is on the cuts to international aid spending, where the government dramatically cut there, but explicitly said, okay, we're doing this in order to fund defense. Yeah. And that made it very difficult to propose.
You turn it into a package.
Yeah.
This idea of going for a more conditional approach, tying it to work requirements, that would take it back to something closer to the original idea. That's what tax credits were initially meant to be. So there was this program under John Major at first with the family credit, and then especially in the Blair years, it was the working families tax credit, I think it was first called, where it was explicitly they did say you have to work for at least 16 hours a week. This is supposed to be an income top-up for low earners. It's not supposed to be an out-of-work benefit. And then at some point, I think in the second term, they split this into the working tax credit and the child tax credit. And the child tax credit did not have any work requirements attached to it. So that was then basically just another benefit, a more conventional benefit. But that went against the original idea. The idea was this is supposed to be a low earner top-up and the kind of benefit that doesn't crowd out work incentives, but does the exact opposite, where you tell people you can get this top up, but you have to do some work. And this would, in a way, take us back a little bit closer to that, because it, as you said, it's had that. That's what I've seen as well. It had some positive impact on employment outcomes. So there was, since there's a specific cutoff point, the year when it was introduced, and they're saying, the idea is that for children born before or until 2017, this doesn't apply. So you have families with 3 children, all born before 2017, and some where 1 child was born after that cutoff point. Yeah. So you have a treatment and control group, and the IFS are saying, well, there has been, it's not colossal, but there is, you can see a difference in employment rates between these two groups, something like 3 percentage points or so, which, given that this has only been in place for a couple of years, looks to me that's not the way they frame it. They almost try to downplay it. But I say if you can see such a gap of several percentage points, that's something, and that sounds like something that's worth preserving.
I mean, going back to child benefit itself, this is a strange issue because it's one that unites the socialist left and the culturally conservative natalist right. The idea that you should pay incentives of some description to people to have children, and those should be universal benefits. And it's an odd argument because I think while many people would see the case for two-child, which is common across most of Europe, the idea that you should keep paying for each additional child that a person has, regardless of circumstance, is not intuitively correct for most people. And it ignores the role the third sector plays in poverty relief. So if somebody felt that it was a pressing concern to relieve child poverty, then the first place one would tend to go is to child poverty relief charities. And the question has not been asked or answered as to whether the level of provision from the third sector is actually adequate for the purpose that this change is going to bring in.
Yeah, I mean, one alternative suggestion, in addition to the income to the work requirements, was to taper down the rate, because currently you get a fixed amount. If you're on universal credit, you basically get a fixed amount per child. Indefinitely, you could, in theory, have 1,000 children and you would get the same amount, although then you probably hit the benefit cap. But one option would be to taper it down. So once, if you're on your third child, it's halved. If you're on your fourth child, it's halved again. Idea being that there's certain economies of scale when it comes to children, and we apply this to the main child benefit, which gets given to most people. That you obviously get a reduced rate on additional children. But I think the stuff under third sector is worth thinking about and not forgetting. But we should probably also mention the government's U-turn on its U-turn on income tax, which, having spent most of the last month basically hinting to everyone who would listen that we're going to put up income tax, we have to put up income tax, sorry, it's now being reported in the Financial Times and more broadly that the government is now not going to put up the rates of income tax, but may cut the thresholds instead. Kristian, what do you make of this?
Yeah, this is, it looks like they're trying to go back to complying with the letter, but not the spirit of the election manifesto. But why you would leak something unpopular and then not do it, I don't quite get, because you can almost get into a situation where you get the political pushback and then none of the benefits that you don't even get the extra tax revenue. It could almost be like with some of the spending U-turns. So definitely on the winter fuel changes, where it didn't happen in the end or only in a modified form, but there was all this outburst of anger at the time that I'm sure that there will be some of the recipients at the next election who will think, well, it's not that I'm worse off financially, but I still have this memory, this vague memory, this government is somehow against me. And this is from their own perspective. Worst of all,
the pre-briefing is not a mystery. It was always the case when a government had a particularly controversial measure that they were very uncertain about, that they would sneakily leak it out to a favoured journalist who would then look at the public reaction to decide whether it was wise or not. But the issue here is this government has got no good options. So everything is being pre-briefed.
Yeah.
And they've created a situation where they look deeply unserious because they look like they don't know what they're doing. They are trying to be told what to do by national focus group through the media. And if they had a core sense of convictions and a serious economic strategy, they would not need to do this. They'd be taking the unpopular decisions they needed to take up front and doing so in a more coherent way than they did with the winter fuel payments, as you noted earlier, and getting on with it. The fact that we were debating earlier about whether the winter fuel payment could have been traded off with the child limit changes shows that a previous unpopular decision was taken by a government and they got away with it for a time. So it's very unclear why they're doing it in this way repetitively when it's clearly causing damage to their credibility.
Well, yeah, what's called kite flying, where you sort of send out a tax policy or an unpopular spending cut and see what the public reaction to it is not unusual. But I think their approach to income tax was not even a case of kite flying. They weren't just sort of suggesting, oh, maybe we'll do it. They were making it quite clear to any journalist who would listen that we're going to do this, we're going to take the hard steps, and maybe we're going to compensate for it by cutting national insurance. But that entirely seems off the table now. So, although it's important to remember that a threshold freeze, or even more so a threshold cut, there's suggestions that they may cut the threshold for paying the 40p rate down to £46,000 from 50-ish thousand pounds, and they may cut the additional rate threshold from 125,000 to 100,000. This is going to mean that people's income tax is going to rise. But as Kristian said, technically it doesn't actually break the Labour manifesto from 2024 because that only refers to rates, not thresholds. I doubt the public will care very much about that. And especially one thing that is also worth noting, that if the threshold for the additional rate does come down to 100,000, this will make one of the worst tax cliff edges in the British economy much, much worse than it already is. Because at £100,000, you see the withdrawal of the personal allowance, which means currently people effectively get a marginal tax rate of 62%. This change will increase that rate to almost 70%. And then when you add on people's student loan repayments, sort of professionals in, say, their early 30s who are approaching £100,000 are going to be facing effective marginal tax rates of almost 80%, which is not far off what we had in the late 1970s. And also, even worse, on top of this, is there's also discussion that the Chancellor is going to introduce new taxes and ways of discouraging salary sacrifice schemes, which a lot of people use currently so that they don't go over the 100,000 limit and lose access to childcare credits. So what you may well end up seeing is a lot of people who previously would have taken a promotion or gone from part-time to full-time will just say, okay, I'm not taking that promotion. I'm a GP. I'm going to work 3 or 4 days a week rather than full-time. And it's just going to exacerbate our productivity issue.
Yeah, and you can tell that these cliff edges, that they have an effect just from the fact that there are lots of people who are who earn just below those points where that kicks in, where you have this bunching effect, where, say, in a fiscally neutral system, you would have something that looks more like a normal distribution. There you see lots of people earning, say, that amount, that threshold, minus £1 or whatever you can realistically get away with. And this is a bit like the effect of with the labor laws in France, where they say these additional protections kick in once a company has a size of, I think, 500 employees. And therefore, there's loads of them that have exactly 499 or 498 employees. And that's one way in which you can check whether tax incentives play a role. When you see bunching effects, when you see lots of people clustering at some implausible level of earnings, or company size, whatever it is, where there's no objective, no logical reason that they should be there, that really shows, yes, people do respond, surprise, surprise, to tax incentives.
Well, happily, it's going to affect senior civil servants in the Treasury. And maybe the BMA will finally have a genuine reason to go on strike.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll move on to our final topic, which is Andy's favorite, which is the nuclear renaissance we may be having. What's going on with nuclear, Andy?
So the good news is that the government have announced that they will allow the nuclear site, as was, Whiffler in Anglesey, to be opened up for Rolls-Royce to deploy their first 3 small modular reactors, which, without going into boring detail, they say can power 3 million homes. So that's great. If you believe in security of supply, i.e. keeping the lights on, ensuring that we don't all freeze to death in winter, if you believe in decarbonisation, so using sources of power that are not fossil fuels, then nuclear power should be a big win. The tricky, thorny question, which is not yet clear, is whether they'll complete the trifecta and improve the affordability of energy with this project. So in theory, they should. Nuclear power worldwide can be delivered quickly. The Koreans have shown this. And it can be delivered affordably. But the UK traditionally is not a good place to do this, and it hasn't been a good place to do this, well, since we started, but particularly since the 1970s and 80s, when we massively increased regulation in order to meet quite arbitrary tests of safety. And this wasn't just us, the Americans did it as well. And what that means is where it takes the Koreans 4 to 6 years to build a nuclear power station, it takes 13 to 17 years in the UK on the government's last estimates. And if we take this particular site, the last project that they tried to put there, the Horizon project with a different type of nuclear technology, they started looking at that in 2009 and then cancelled it 10 years later in 2019. The nuclear regulator having imposed changes on the operator that amounted to trying to save the amount of radiation that would be emitted by eating a banana. And this is just one of a myriad of examples of completely unnecessary costs and delays imposed by bad regulation.
Yeah.
So it's just not clear at the moment that the government have tackled that root cause of cost. So while the ambition is fantastic, what I'm worried about is that we will build yet another very expensive nuclear industry that nobody else wants to buy. Now, in fairness to Rolls-Royce, this is not a criticism of their technology. We don't yet know whether it's going to work, and they've already secured some export orders. They proudly announced the Czech Republic, for example, Czechia. But there is a worldwide nuclear renaissance going on. And in that renaissance, there are now approaching 100 companies with different technologies. So Rolls-Royce are going to have their work cut out, proving that this potentially very expensive British technology is better than the rest. And they're going to need to do that if they want to export.
Yeah. We saw some complaints from the US ambassador to Britain that Rolls-Royce may have been, which I believe was the only British small modular reactor company that was bidding for this contract and ended up getting it, that this was basically an example of closet protectionism. Do you think anything to that?
No, and boo-hoo. I mean, the Americans are going down a terrible route of picking the winner themselves. So there is an utterly bizarre deal being done by Trump with Westinghouse and the AP1000 technology, where the Japanese have agreed to borrow, or buy a large amount of American bonds. And then the Westinghouse will be able to use public money to build some of this new technology in a way that is entirely anti-competitive, even with other domestic US suppliers. So neither the UK nor the Americans have adopted a pro-market competitive model. They're both going down the route that if we go back to our old friend Nick Clegg, when he said in 2010 that we would not be offering public subsidies to any nuclear power company, which is often reported as his entire opposition to the technology, we are now doing precisely that in both countries. And it's a terrible error.
Yeah. Is there anything about the small modular reactor technology itself that may allow greater economies of scale, learning by doing, that seem to have escaped us entirely in Britain?
No, not at all. In fact, that's the big sell from Rolls-Royce. They're not claiming that their pressurized water reactors are particularly innovative in themselves. But what they are saying is that their modularization approach, the standardization of parts, and the fact they're all concentrated on one site will enable them to save costs in the longer term. And this is the Korean model in part, where they managed to save a lot of money in their production by sticking to one design. It's also the French 20th century model, which they sadly haven't repeated with the ones they built recently.
Yeah. Kristian, you're from a country with a strained relationship from nuclear power.
Yeah, I'm not going to read headlines like that in the old country ever again.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you have any insight into why so many sort of ostensibly very green environmentalists and environmentalist groups have been so hostile to the rollout of nuclear energy, despite the fact that it's zero carbon?
Depends on where exactly you're talking about. So there are some differences here. In the German case, it's quite clear that simply the Green Party, the Green Movement, grew out of a wider anti-nuclear movement, and for them, this has always been part of their founding story. They cannot give up on that. That you can show them all the carbon statistics in the world and about how this is really from their own perspective, if they want to reach their version of net zero quickly and so forth, that this is the best way to do it. They would just refuse it because it's just in their DNA. It would be like
Labour banning trade unions or something.
Yeah, or the NHS. So it's just part of the founding myth. Here, it hasn't quite worked out that way. It may be it may just really be that more often than not, environmentalism cannot be separated from anti-capitalism, and that they somehow have this idea that even on its own terms it's not quite coherent, because even renewable energy is usually provided by private companies and they make money from it. So even if you're an anti-capitalist, it doesn't automatically follow that you should say, yeah, this industry is better than that one, but somehow that seems to be the kind of thinking. But yes, it's always a bit In a way, I think I've said this before, that the anti-nuclear bias here is in a way more frustrating than the German one, because there you can at least see, okay, this is obviously, yes, and it's obviously irrational, but once you account for that, you can see why they're doing it. Here, there isn't quite the same instinctive hostile reaction, other than okay, well, what you can say about every Westerner, that we've grown up with seeing the three-eyed fish in The Simpsons, and we think this is what nuclear energy means.
Yeah, and okay, again, I'm probably going to get sacked at some point, but I'm going to now defend Ed Miliband, because at least we have lots and lots of issues with Ed, and have for 15 years plus. But at least, unlike many other environmentalists, he doesn't seem to have an innate, really, really hostile reaction to nuclear energy. And you can at least say that for him.
Yes, he's not completely mad.
Yeah.
I have also defended Ed Miliband at various occasions at the same risk.
Okay.
But I think what we've got to say is that we all hope this succeeds. But I think he's looking at the wrong end of the problem.
Yeah.
And it's generally... Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, if Rolls-Royce does deliver on time, and the technology then is something that other people want to buy, then he will have been justified in some of the decisions he takes.
Yeah.
But anybody who believes in markets also thinks that he could have got to this point far more easily if he'd tackled the other things first. And then we might not need to have a national champion in a partnership with some weird entity called Great British Energy Nuclear, with ministers crawling all over the appointments boards and everything else. We could have just simply had Westinghouse, Hitachi and all the others compete with Rolls-Royce and let the best technology win. And this is quite big for SMR technology, small modular reactors. Some other people are looking at much smaller models where you get the learning by doing experience far faster. You get the innovation in the supply chain much quicker. And this may not be a good idea even if it succeeds, because it will have overspent and done so in the wrong way on the wrong things.
Okay. Well, Ed, if you're watching, you can find Andy's email address on our website. So do feel free to send him a line, and he'll be happy to provide you with extra advice and encouragement. But with that, I think we're going to have to call it a day here. So thank you all for watching and listening. Do remember to subscribe, give us 5 stars, all that kind of thing. And we will see you next week.